Welcome back to Management 2020. In this video, we'll talk about presentations that help inform the audience. So we'll talk about different types of informative presentations, and then we'll also talk about some presenter skills, specifically focusing on body language and the pronunciation concept of suprasegmentals. So an informative presentation generally has a purpose of doing one of these four things: explaining something, describing it, demonstrating, or reporting on it. So these are different than types of presentations that have a more persuasive focus. Informative presentations are usually giving updates on something or teaching something, but there isn't the goal of convincing the audience of something. So as we prepare an informative presentation, it's helpful to go through these questions. What does the audience need to know? What does the audience already know? And how can we frame the information in a way that the audience is going to care about what they don't already know so that they will be open to learning about that topic? As we explore this idea of learning, teaching and learning, the textbook brings up the concept of multiple intelligences theories. And this became, I think, very popular around turn of the millennium. And there was maybe this perception that there's lots of different ways of being intelligent, and that if we can match someone's preferred learning style to the instruction they receive, they will learn better. In truth, this has kind of been debunked by social science in the 20 years since these theories really hit their rise in popularity. It's not to say that there aren't these different ways of learning, and it's not to say that there isn't value in these different ways of learning, but there isn't enough evidence to suggest that people learn best when they're matched with their preferred learning style. In fact, most people can learn from a variety of different styles, and really what we should consider is when we're trying to teach and inform people is to use multiple modes of presentation in order to appeal to the widest variety of people in different ways. So having visuals, having written word, having spoken word, doing maybe sometimes physical activities with people, using music, using other types of ways that we can learn and receive information. But it's not the sense that there's just this perfect mode for everyone, and if we could just match each person with their perfect mode, that they'd all learn perfectly, and there's not evidence for that. So let's talk about some presenter skills that can help us when we're doing presentations to inform, and we'll talk about some body language concepts that I think should be familiar to most of us. And then we'll also talk about this concept of suprasegmentals as part of pronunciation. And this might be some new language, but I think it will fit with your understanding of how English language works. So first, let's talk about posture. Again, this is maybe something that gets into, we're having to debunk some theories. There was this idea that came out in the business and the presentation world that there were power poses. And if you just used enough of these power poses, your audience would almost be forced to accept your message. That has since been debunked. There is no perfect power poses that make presenters seem more credible or more believable in a way that is almost supernatural. But posture still impacts audience. The way we present our body, the way we stand, or the way we sit can impact how our audience perceives us and our message. So we do want to have good posture. We want to stand up if we can, or sit up if we can, in a way that suggests that we're attentive, we're interested in the topic, and we're ready to engage with our audience. Also, if we're able to move around during the presentation can help, mostly in the sense that as we move around, we're getting closer to, if we're with a big audience, we're showing interest and closeness to a wide variety of audience members, and we're not just favoring part of the audience. And so in moving around, we don't want to be running or pacing. That can sometimes make audiences nervous, but some gentle, slow movements can help draw in the audience. Facial expressions are also have a huge impact. And in general, having a positive, smiling face helps set the audience at ease and helps them feel good about the information you're presenting. So, if possible, use a warm expression as you present. Gestures can also be helpful. We do want to be careful with gestures that we're not overusing gestures. I'm a person who tends to gesture a lot when I speak, and I try to be careful to make sure that those are controlled gestures and that I'm not distracting my audience by my use of gesture. But sometimes some gestures can help with some of the organizational factors of our message, right? By showing things like this and that or ordering things. So sometimes thoughtful, controlled gestures can be useful. So those are just some small body language topics, but there's certainly more than that. But let's move in and talk more about suprasegmentals. So suprasegmentals are a feature of pronunciation, and we call them suprasegmentals because they're going beyond or they're bigger than the pronunciation features that we call segmentals. And segmentals are individual sounds. So consonants and vowels are considered segmentals, but the features of pronunciation that go beyond consonants and vowels we would call suprasegmentals. And two suprasegmentals that are very impactful on the way English is perceived and understood is stress and rhythm. And so we can think about stress in two ways. Word stress, which syllable within the word gets stressed, but also sentence stress, which is sometimes referred to as rhythm. So let's take a look at an example here of word stress. So the word communicate has 4 syllables, 4 main vowel sounds. And if we weren't familiar with English and weren't familiar with this word, we might not know which syllable receives the most stress. In some languages, all syllables receive equal stress. And this is, when we think back to, computers and artificial intelligence concepts of maybe the 1980s, that's how computers spoke. Communicate. Every syllable was given equal stress. But that's not how most words are pronounced in English. In English, one of the syllables is likely to get more stress than the others, and the other syllables are often weaker. And when they're weaker, they're pronounced more softly, more quickly, and at a lower tone. So we don't hear them as clearly. This is why sometimes it's hard for learners of English to understand new words because each syllable is not pronounced clearly. But this is done intentionally. This is how we communicate the meaning of words in English is by stressing some syllables more than others. Now, in some languages, it's very predictable where the stress is going to happen in a word. We can tell that it's on a certain syllable always. In English, there are some patterns, but those patterns are influenced by many different languages that English has borrowed words from. And so the patterns are a little more complex that we won't go into in this video, but it is important to understand that there are some syllables that will be stressed more than others. So here's the example of our word communicate. We tend to stress in this word the second and then the last syllable, communicate. And the com and the I are weaker. We don't hear them as strong. Communicate. So those words, the mun and the kate, are pronounced more slowly with a higher pitch and with a clearer vowel sound. I've worked with students who maybe come from different language backgrounds and try to use academic words in English and don't get the stress right to the point where it's actually difficult to understand the word. Because English speakers are expecting stress in certain ways, a word could sound completely different to an English speaker and they won't recognize it if it doesn't have the correct stress. For example, I had a graduate student who told me that she was in a course about anatomy. I didn't know what anatomy was. I'm an English speaker. I should know this word. But what I realized is she wasn't trying to say anatomy. She was trying to say anatomy. But when the stress shifts, a lot of the vowel and consonant sounds in that word sound differently. And anatomy sounds very differently than anatomy to an English speaker. Now, beyond individual word stress, we have what's called sentence stress, and this is sometimes called rhythm. So in addition to having some syllables in a word that are stressed more than others, when we come to sentences, some words in a sentence are stressed more than others. And those are the words that are the clearest, that are said more slowly and more clearly and at a higher pitch. Some of the words are not stressed very well. They're said quickly at a lower pitch. And the general pattern is that if a word is a content word, meaning noun, verb, adjective, adverb, it's likely to be pronounced clearly. If a word is a functional word that has a more grammatical purpose, pronouns, prepositions, articles, those types of words are pronounced usually much more quietly. So the phrase here, if we said every word with equal stress, it would be my manager wants an update on the project. That's really hard for an English speaker to understand that sentence because they're not shown through stress patterns which words contain the most meaning. Every word is given equal stress, and so their brain, an English speaker's brain, has to work much harder to figure out which of those words mattered, which of those words need to be focused on. And so instead, the rhythm of English usually is, my manager wants an update on the project. And if we were to go back and analyze that sentence, we'd hear that manager, update, and project are spoken very clearly. The other words are spoken more quietly and quickly. My manager wants an update on the project. And so what happens in English when a word is not stressed, it tends to get squished into the same time frame as an entire word that does get stressed. So wants an becomes wantsen, and on the becomes on the. Those words kind of get squished together. And so understanding these patterns in English can help us speak more in a way that our audience can understand us better. If we give too much stress to everything, we're not as clearly understood. And this is often what might happen when someone's reading a script and they're reading each word with equal timing and weight, and then it doesn't sound like a natural speech pattern in English. In addition to stress patterns, let's also talk briefly about intonation and pitch. So intonation and pitch are how high or how low our words are pronounced in almost a musical sense, a high pitch or a low pitch. And usually, over the course of a sentence, English speakers use rising and then falling intonation patterns. And this signals to the audience, I'm making a statement, or I'm finished speaking at the end of my sentence. That falling pitch pattern at the end signals this is the end or this is factual information. But on the other hand, when we use a rising pattern at the end of our sentence, it can communicate doubt, or it can also signal to the audience, I'm going to keep talking, you can't interrupt me, I'm not done yet. So often there are certain yes-no questions, for instance, we'll use a rising pattern. Do you want to go to the meeting at 12? We also can use it, or we can take a sentence and turn it into a question by using a rising pattern. Marie won't be at the meeting today versus Marie won't be at the meeting today. That falling pattern confirms it's a statement, but the rising pattern changes that statement into a question. So when we're providing a list of items in a question, items in a list, we're going to use rising intonation patterns at the end of each item to signal to the listener the list isn't finished yet. Okay? When you come to the meeting, I want you to bring a computer. I want you to bring a paper and a pen, and I want you to be ready to take notes. So with each item in the list, I went up until I got to the last one, and then there's that following pattern. Same way when someone's maybe telling a story. When they're telling a story to someone, they might use multiple sentences, but they may use a rising pattern at the end of their sentences to signal to the audience, I'm not finished with the story yet, don't interrupt me yet. One last thing we want to talk about in suprasegmentals is the idea of pausing and pace, and making sure that when we deliver our message, we're not speaking so slowly that the audience can't follow along, or they get annoyed, or so quickly that they're having trouble understanding what we're saying. And pausing and pace can be used for dramatic effect in our story, to draw attention to certain words or phrases, but also to sort of maybe build excitement and move through a topic more quickly. So we should be careful about how we use pausing and effect, that we're using a pace that's appropriate for our audience. I will often adjust my pace depending on the audience I'm working with, or depending on the message I'm sharing. Sometimes I'm sharing a message that's more technical, more detailed, and so I might slow down to give more emphasis to the topics. But other times maybe I'm reviewing information that I know the audience will already know, and I just want to remind them of it, so I might move through it more quickly. So in this video, we talked about different types of informative presentations and then briefly looked over some of the presenter skills that involve both body language and suprasegmentals. And I encourage you to pay attention to these skills as you give presentations so that you're thinking about how can I present a message clearly and appropriately for my audience.